Thanks for joining us on New American Health Talk Radio, AM 1440 and AM1440.com. I'm Chris Costello. Today we're talking with Dr. Dean Ornish, author of The Spectrum and many other best-selling books, named by Life magazine as one of the 50 most influential members of his generation. Dr. Dean Ornish has also served on the Senate Committee for Integrative Medicine and is the founder and president of the nonprofit Preventative Medicine Research Institute in Sausalito, California. We're so pleased to have Dr. Dean Ornish joining us today on New American Health Talk Radio. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Ornish. You had a wonderful quote in Spectrum. You said, a quote by Sophocles, that one word that frees us all from the weight and pain in life, and that word is love.
Yes. Well, we're often using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art measures to prove the power of these very low-tech and low-cost and often ancient observations like Sophocles made, that, study after study has shown that people who don't feel a sense of love and connection community are many times more likely to get sick and die prematurely than those who have that. And so, in part because you're more likely to abuse yourself, you're more likely to smoke and overeat and drink too much and work too hard and so on, when you don't feel that sense of love and connection community. But even through mechanisms we don't fully understand, when people have a sense of love and connection community, they're much more likely to avoid getting sick and dying prematurely.
That's fascinating. Now, with reversing disease, what are the most important things that people can do to regain their health?
Well, it's a different conception about health than I was taught in medical school. That health is not something you gain. Health is something you have already until you disturb it in most cases. That our bodies have, in many cases, a remarkable capacity to begin healing themselves, and much more quickly than we had once realized, if we simply stop doing what's causing the problem in the first place. And I studied yoga for many years with a spiritual teacher named Swami Satchidananda. And people say, "What are you, a Hindu?" He'd say, "No, I'm an undu." And that's really a shorthand way of saying that what we try to do is to identify what's causing the problem and then help people to change that. Usually when I lecture, I often show a cartoon of doctors busily mopping up the floor around a sink that's overflowing, but nobody's turning off the faucet. And when we turn off the faucet, then we allow healing to occur. On a spiritual level, people think that happiness is something that you get. If only I had more this or that or less of this or that, then I'd be happy. More money, more power, more beauty, more accomplishments, whatever it happens to be. And the more they believe that, generally the more stressed and the more unhappy they feel. Until they get it, they feel stressed. If somebody else gets it and they don't, they feel even worse. And even if they get it, it's very seductive because it makes you think that your happiness and well-being came from getting this thing that you thought you needed. But it's never enough. It's like, well, now what? One patient said, "I can't even enjoy the view from the mountain I've climbed. I'm already looking over at the next one." Or, so what? Big deal. It doesn't really provide that lasting sense of meaning and happiness. And so what we try to do, and even the yoga and meditation techniques that we include in the back of the Spectrum, there's a DVD that my wife, Ann, has created. She's, I think, the best yoga teacher in the country right now. I'm obviously a little bit biased, but even before we had that kind of relationship, I was saying that about her. And the meditation and yoga don't bring you a sense of peace and well-being. What they help you do is to stop disturbing, at least temporarily, what's there all the time. And that may sound like a semantic distinction, but it's a very powerful, profound one, because if we think that happiness is something that we have to get or health is something we have to get, then it's always like, what am I lacking and how can I get it? But if we say, well, wait a minute, that's our nature to be happy until we disturb it, that's a very empowering realization, not to blame but to empower, to say, oh, if it's me, I can do something about that. I can react in different ways. I may be looking in the wrong places. And so, seen from this perspective, the suffering that many people are experiencing in the world, without in any way trying to minimize it, can be a very powerful wake-up call to help us re-examine what really matters and what may not matter as much as we once thought.
And is it sometimes as simple as making a decision?
Decision in what sense?
Just to be happy. I mean, I kind of chuckled last night because one of the computer news stations mentioned that an asteroid had missed the Earth by an uncomfortable amount of miles. Did you hear about that?
I hate when that happens.
Yeah, but I thought, gee, I really do need to be happy every minute because you never know,
Well, it's so easy to be glib and say to somebody who's suffering, oh, suck it up, be happy, and then, the proper response is a nice Hawaiian punch to me. But without in any way trying to minimize anyone's suffering, I know from my own experience that I have much greater degrees of freedom than I had once realized about how I interact with the world. That stress is not just what happens to you, it's how you react to what's happening to you. In the study of telomeres that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who discovered telomerase, will probably win a Nobel Prize for her discovery, and we collaborated on this study showing that lifestyle changes increased telomerase and thus telomere length, had done an earlier study 4 years ago with Alyssa Epple, where she found that the more, when she looked at women who were under chronic emotional stress because they were taking care of kids with birth defects or autism, some really awful things, that the more the women felt stressed and the longer they reported feeling stressed, the lower their telomerase and the shorter their telomeres, meaning they would live a shorter lifespan and all other things being equal. But it wasn't an objective measure of stress. It was the women's perception of it that really determined whether or not it affected them. And it wasn't necessarily a function of how bad somebody else might think their circumstances were. To some degree, if you're in a concentration camp, that's going to be a lot more stressful than having lunch at Starbucks. But even in the concentration camp, Viktor Frankl wrote about, in a book called Man's Search for Meaning, that not everybody survived, and that the people who survived generally reacted to these dire circumstances in ways where they found a sense of purpose and meaning that enabled them to cope with it. And so what I'm learning in my own life in much less dire circumstances is that I have a much greater degree of choice than I had once realized, that I don't necessarily have to react in the same ways. One of the nice things about practicing yoga and meditation on a regular basis is that even without having to think about it, we react in different ways. As people say things like, I used to have a short fuse and I'd explode easily, and now my fuse is longer. In other words, things are the same. I'm in the same job, the same family, the same environment, but I'm not reacting in the same way. So, and it's not like people have to tell themselves not to react. Their fuse is longer. And everybody's experienced the opposite. When you're really tired and raggedy and run down, the day-to-day small aggravations can often be enormously stressful. So we have a lot more choice in this than we had once realized. But even on an intellectual, cognitive level, we have a lot more choice. My wife and I have been teaching our 8-year-old son, Lucas, about this, to say, just because something happens to you doesn't mean it necessarily needs to get all upset about it or stressed out or cry or whatever it happens to be. We can honor and validate that experience, but to say, that's a legitimate experience, but it's not a fun experience. And we have more choice than we realize, and we can make something positive out of it. And it's a lot more enjoyable to be able to react in those kinds of ways. Somebody might be laid off in this economy, and that might be an awful thing, and it is an awful thing. And then without in any way trying to say, hey, what a great thing is you got laid off, or hey, what a great thing you got cancer, to say, okay, well, we don't look for suffering, but there it is. Now what do we do with it? And to say, okay, well, maybe I'm being guided by an unseen hand is one way to contextualize it. Or maybe there's another way to look at this, that maybe there's an opportunity to do what I really wanted to do in my life, and I was afraid to quit my job, and now I have an opportunity to really do what my real passion is. And, those kinds of things without in any way trying to minimize or make wrong or change someone else's experience, to say, look, as my teacher used to tell me, if you want to keep banging your head against the wall, keep doing it. Don't blame the wall. But they're more healthy and they're more joyful ways of living in the world than ones that may have become habitual.
Right, and there's always that element of surprise. I mean, you look at someone like Eckhart Tolle, who sat on a park bench for 2 years, and, look where he is now. When he was on the park bench, could he have seen where he was going to go? Probably not.
Well, it's the same in my life. If you told me 30 years ago when I was depressed and suicidal, or 40 years ago now, when I was in 1970, 35 years ago anyway, that this is what I'd be doing now, I would have thought you were nuts. And maybe part of the, it's part of the mystery of life is that we don't necessarily know. But I have it may be a delusion, but it's a very functional delusion, and that everything that's happening to me is for the best. And I may not be able to, it's nice to be able to see it in real time. It's always easier to see it in retrospect. But, if I can see it as it's happening, or at least remind myself of that, it gives me more degrees of freedom in how I interact with things rather than woe is me, which doesn't really take me anywhere except to a really unhappy place.
Right. And why is stress so debilitating for the human body?
Well, stress affects all of our systems. When you're depressed, your immune system is depressed. Your heart is more likely to get clogged up. It's more likely to beat irregularly. It lowers the threshold for sudden cardiac death. So in virtually every way we can measure, stress, again, defining it as this chronic, destructive way of relating to the world. That stress, it's like tuning a violin. You need a certain amount of tension on the string to play music. If it's too much, then the string breaks. If it's not enough, then not much happens. So these techniques of stretching and breathing and meditation and yoga, as well as the more spiritual approaches of altruism and compassion and love and forgiveness, can help free us from a lot of this stress and suffering